Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Program, which organized tonight's event. I'd like to welcome our live audience here in San Francisco and our radio and online audiences. It's my great pleasure to introduce Joseph Nye Jr., the author of Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. Joseph Nye is known as a great scholar. He has done so many things in the government. He is known as one of the most influential foreign policy advisors over the last decades. And it's really a great pleasure that we have you here today to talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, George. It's nice to be in San Francisco, and I know that people often say things like that when they're visiting, and they don't really mean it. But if you were from New England at this time of year, you'd know I mean it. Let me tell you a little bit about this book that I've written, Do Morals Matter, which has kind of an odd title, a question mark in the title. People say, by and large, they don't in international relations, that the conventional wisdom is that it's really all national interest, and moral views are like icing that a leader pours on the cake to make it look pretty, but it's national interests that bake the cake. And my experience in working in government, as well as in reading and writing some history, was that view is not accurate. That if you don't realize that sometimes the moral view of the president was an essential ingredient in the cake, not just icing sprinkled on top to make it look pretty, you're going to get history wrong. And so one of the reasons that I wrote this book was to look at the 14 presidents who have led us in foreign policy since 1945, and to ask, did it matter what their moral views were? So the book has two purposes. One is to answer the question of the title. Historically, did it matter? And I think I come up with demonstrations of the answer yes. And the other part is, okay, if it matters, how should we think about it? So these are the two purposes of the book. Let me just take a minute or two on the first question, proving that morals matter, that they were an ingredient, not just icing on the cake. And I'll give you the example of Harry Truman. Harry Truman was a very simple man, a farm boy who never went to college, but had strong sense of self, of what he thought was right or wrong. And yet when Truman was faced with the question of should you drop a nuclear weapon on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he did, and he said in his memoirs he didn't lose much sleep over it. But people often stop the story there. For example, there was a famous philosopher at Oxford, moral philosopher, who refused to go to the ceremony at Oxford in 1948 in which Truman was given an honorary degree. And she said she could never go to a ceremony for somebody who had dropped the atomic bomb. But what people don't realize is the next steps in the story. For example, in 1945, there was another bomb ready to be dropped. And Truman said no, he was not going to allow the military to drop the third bomb. And the reason is that he didn't want to kill any more women and children. So he was quite a quick learner in terms of bringing about his moral views on this. But even more impressive was what he did in 1950, when he was losing the war in Korea. The Chinese had crossed the Yalu River, had pushed the Americans down the peninsula, almost into the sea in the south. And he was told that if he lost this war, or the war was stalemated, it would destroy his presidency. He couldn't run for re-election in 52. And he knew that, and Douglas MacArthur, who was the World War II hero, the general who was in charge of the Far East Theater, told Truman, if you allow me to drop 25 to 40 atomic bombs on Chinese cities, I will win this war for you. And Truman said no. He said, nope, I'm not going to kill that many more women and children. And that's quite interesting because it did have a very negative effect on his presidency. But if you want to ask what the world would look like if Truman had decided differently, if he decided to further his personal interest and political interest, or a view of the national interest that included using nuclear weapons as normal everyday weapons rather than just for deterrence, the world would look very different today. And when Thomas Schelling, the Nobel Prize laureate, was giving his Nobel address, Schelling said the most important thing that happened in the past 70 years was the development of the nuclear taboo, that the nuclear weapons were to be used just for deterrence and not for war fighting. Imagine if Truman had not done that, if his moral views had not been one of the key ingredients of the cake of how we define national interest, it would be a very different world that we live in today. The world would look very, very different. So that's, I would submit, an example of how the moral views of a president made a huge difference in terms of allowing a one world to develop rather than a very different world that might have developed. So if and I think I make more cases than just the Truman case in the book, but I'm not going to belabor them this evening. But if we've demonstrated that nuclear weapons are an example, what about other moral issues? And if moral issues are crucial, then how should we think about them? When I served in the State Department some years ago, I remember dealing with a nuclear negotiation, and I turned to one of my French interlocutors, and I said, what do you think about the moral issues that are involved in this question of nuclear proliferation? And he said, I don't think one has to worry about morality. There is no international morality. The only thing I concern myself with is the interests of France. And I don't think he ever realized what a profound moral judgment he had just made. In other words, he had just retreated into this view that it's the national interest that matters and nothing else. But Americans sometimes aren't much better. When we sort of look at actions and we say, how do we justify them, or what's the way we judge them? Very often we tend to say, well, we're a good people, so if we did it, it must be good, which is, of course, a non sequitur. Or it turned out all right, so it must be good, which is also a non sequitur. And what I try to do in the book is to make an argument that when you're dealing with complex moral issues, as you find in international relations, you need to think in three dimensions. I call it 3D morality. You have to consider the motives, the means, and the consequences, and then try to balance all three in an assessment of the actions. That is perhaps illustrated or illustrable by a simple example, metaphor if you want, which I will describe for you now. Imagine that your daughter was about to take the SATs, and she was going to a high school dance on a Friday night, and a friend says, I know she has to get home early, and I will drive her home from the dance, and I'll make sure she's home early. And your friend, in driving her home, doesn't pay attention to the fact that the road has iced up and is driving at 80 miles an hour, skids off the road, and hits a tree, and your daughter is killed. Would you say to him, oh, I forgive you, your intentions were good? Or would you say you used inappropriate means and had horrible consequences and didn't pay enough attention to the prospect that those consequences, even though unintended, could occur? And I think you can make the same kind of argument when we deal with some international events. For example, when George W. Bush, Bush 43, invaded Iraq in 2003, many people said his motives were bad. I don't agree with that. People say Bush lied and boys died. I think, in fact, Bush was concerned about Saddam Hussein developing nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. That was broadly assessed the same way by most of the world's intelligence agencies. And I think Bush also thought that if he could democratize Iraq, he could remove the roots of terrorism. And so let's grant him good motives. But if you look at the means he used, they were inadequate. What he did was plunge in with the military, which allowed him to remove Saddam Hussein, but it didn't allow him to democratize Iraq or reconstruct Iraq. And there were many papers that were prepared in the State Department and in the intelligence community warning about the difficulties of reconstruction in Iraq, and they were ignored. The White House tossed them aside. And the net effect in terms of consequences was you had stimulation of a civil war between Shia and Sunnis and the strengthening of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually morphed into the Islamic State. So horrific consequences. I would argue that's quite similar to that little road accident example I gave, and that we can judge by all three dimensions. Bush's press secretary, Ari Fleischer, said that Bush's actions on Iraq were marked by wonderful moral clarity because he spoke of his freedom agenda. And what I'm saying is if you look at three dimensions, not just your motives or your intentions, but also the means and the consequences, you'll say that the action was not a moral action. And that we've got to, as a people, be more honest with ourselves as we look at these questions of what is a moral policy. Now, if you look a little deeper at the issue of motives and intentions, almost all politicians will say they have good intentions. After all, that's how they get elected. But their intentions, as stated, may be twisted or diverted from where they start by their emotional needs. Their motives may be a little different than their stated intentions. And a good example of this is the case of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, the stated intentions of both, let's say, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were to prevent North Vietnam from imposing a totalitarian system upon South Vietnam. And you could say, all right, that could be seen as a good intention. But when you put that through the emotional motives of the two presidents, you get something a little different. Kennedy never allowed the total number of troops to go above 16,000, and he called them advisors. Johnson, of course, let the number go up to 565,000, and that led to American deaths in Vietnam of 58,000. So quite a different set of consequences. About 160 Americans died in Vietnam while Kennedy was president, as opposed to some 30,000 while Johnson was president. Now, McGeorge Bundy, who was a hawk on Vietnam and an advisor to both Kennedy and Johnson, was asked after he'd retired, what would have happened if Kennedy had not been assassinated? And what Bundy said is he thought Kennedy would have found some excuse to withdraw after his reelection. Johnson, on the other hand, did just the opposite, as I mentioned. And Bundy's answer for that is he said Kennedy emotionally wanted to be seen as smart. Johnson emotionally wanted to be seen as not a coward. His background in Texas, the need to appear macho, the image of what he thought his father would have wanted from him, meant that Johnson knew that the war was not going well, but couldn't face the prospect of being the man who lost Vietnam. And that emotional need twisted his intentions and motives to something which turned out to be a disaster. So when we look at motives and intentions, we have to look not just at the statements, but also the way the emotional intelligence of the president may or may not twist them in one direction or another. Similarly, when we look at means, we have to realize that sometimes it's inevitable that a political leader is going to have to use means that we would not want to tolerate in our personal behavior. For example, you might say when you're choosing a friend or a roommate or a spouse, somebody who said, "I will not kill," is kind of a nice characteristic. On the other hand, when it comes to voting for president, I would find it hard to vote for a perfect pacifist who would say, under no circumstances will I allow soldiers to be used. Because there may be circumstances in which, to protect the people who elected you, you have to go against your own internal motives of thou shalt not kill and admit that in a world that's difficult, you sometimes have to allow this type of behavior. I think in that case, you'll find that the circumstances in which a president uses or doesn't use force should be guided by something that's called just war theory, which has come down to us through the centuries from the dilemma that Augustine wrestled with in the 4th century AD, but it's become secularized and now plays or forms the basis for international humanitarian law, and domestically, it's the basis for the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which all our military is supposed to live by. And what Augustine faced in the 4th century was the dilemma that as the Roman Empire began to break down and disorder occurred, if the good did not protect themselves, the bad would prevail. And so Augustine said, the Bible tells me thou shalt not kill. But if I tell my parishioners, my flock, to perfectly obey that, then they will be eliminated and only the bad will prevail. So he developed a set of principles as to when you'd be allowed to violate the rule, thou shalt not kill. And it had to do with a very narrow definition of self-defense. If somebody was coming at you to kill you, you could kill him in self-defense. But notice that means when you get to modern Uniform Code of Military Justice, if somebody's running at you shooting and you're shooting back, but then he stops and drops his rifle and throws up his hands, you can no longer shoot him, even though 30 seconds ago you could. And the reason, according to Augustine, is he's no longer an imminent threat to you. And therefore, there is a new principle, which is the question of self-defense based on an imminent threat. That then adds other conditions, such as when you are fighting with large groups, that you distinguish between civilians and non-civilians, and that you keep a sense of proportion, so that if you see that there's a terrorist in an apartment building that has 70 families in it, and you know you can drop a bomb on that building and kill the terrorist, you'll accomplish your goal, but you'll kill 70 families as well. That's disproportionate means, and that's not acceptable. And then finally, there has to be a reasonable prospect of success. So in that sense, this tradition that has come down to us through the ages has set some limits on the extreme uses of force. Now, there are circumstances where you say, what if it is so bad that I have no choice? What if it is a matter of survival? And there are cases that are like that. When the Germans drove the British into the sea at Dunkirk in 1940, Winston Churchill feared for the survival of the British islands. He knew that if the French Navy, which had now belonged to German-occupied France, was added to the German Navy, it would undercut the ability of the British Navy to defend the islands. And what he did, which is quite awful in some ways, is he bombed his ally, the French fleet, and killed something like 1,300 French sailors. But his feeling was that it was a matter of survival for the British people, that they had voted for him to protect them, and he had to conduct this very immoral act as a way for survival. So there may be some circumstances in international affairs where, because there's no higher government and no enforceable law, that bad actions in terms of personal behavior are acceptable in international politics. Philosophers sometimes call this the problem of dirty hands, that you can't have pure, clean hands if you're protecting other people, if you're their trustee. But there's a big difference between saying such circumstances may arise from time to time and saying that that means we can justify any action. And an example of this I would submit is questions of human rights, where people will often say, well, we can't do anything to defend human rights because it's a tough world out there. So, for example, when the Saudi government dismembered Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who lived in Washington, dismembered him in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, President Trump's reaction was, well, we have interests in oil, we have interests in arms sales, and it's a tough world out there. We just got to get over it. And he was treating the dismemberment of Khashoggi as though it was like Churchill defending the British islands against Hitler capturing the French fleet. It wasn't. And to compress that as though there are no differences is an enormous cop-out in morality. Even the Wall Street Journal, a conservative editorial board, condemned the president for not defending American values in a case like that. And finally, before I turn to concluding, one has to also ask, are presidents, as they make their decisions on morality, are they thinking not just of particular actions, but of the effect on the system as a whole in the long run? In other words, are they thinking of institutions or not? Philosophers will sometimes distinguish what's called act utilitarianism from rule utilitarianism. An act utilitarian says, on this particular action, what's the greatest good for the greatest number? And those are the consequences. A rule utilitarian would say, in addition to that calculation of what's the greatest good for the greatest number in this particular case, if I wind up breaking a lot of rules, what's that going to do for the future greatest good of the greatest number? And that's a very important aspect of international relations in foreign policy. There is a tendency in textbooks on international relations to say that because it's anarchic, there's no higher government, there's a strong incentive to cheat. And there's a game that's sometimes called prisoner's dilemma, where if one prisoner squeals on the other, he'll get off free, and the other prisoner squeals, then the other one he'll be told he'll get off free, but they both go to jail. So there's a strong incentive to cheat in this game. But there was a test done by a political scientist named Robert Axelrod at the University of Michigan, who said, if you play this game once, you're very likely to cheat. But if you keep playing the game again and again and again, and you're going to be playing with the same people over a long period of time, you learn that the best strategy is actually reciprocity. You cheat on me, I cheat on you. You cooperate with me, I cooperate with you. And after time, you realize that you're better off in the long run if you develop this cooperation. Axelrod called that the long shadow of the future, that how you play each round of the game can be affected not just by the incentives of that round, but on the long-term outcome of the game. And in that sense, I think what we're seeing in American foreign policy nowadays is that while the early founding presidents thought hard about creating alliances and institutions and structures which would create a long shadow of the future, we now tend to be backing away from that and treating everything as single transactions. And I think that leaves us the worse off over the long run. So the issues of how you think about consequences become quite complicated when you have to take into account not just each individual action, but the cumulative effect over time. Secretary of State George Shultz, who was secretary under Ronald Reagan, said, we have to think of foreign policy not as a set of transactions in a bazaar or market, but more like growing a garden. You weed a little here, you trim there, you hoe there, but it's for a long term that you try to develop this garden. And that is a major part of what we want to see in terms of an ethical foreign policy. So when I summarize this and I try to say, looking back over the 14 presidents since 1945, how do I think they scored when I compare or add up motives, means, and consequences, all three dimensions of making moral judgments? I come out with the four best in my scoring as Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush. The four worst are Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, the second President Bush, Bush 43, and tentatively, because we don't know the outcome yet, President Trump, though I would give him a note that says incomplete but needs further attention. But the point of this is not that my scoring of these presidents is accurate or inaccurate.
What I really care about is that as people think about morality and foreign policy, they don't fall for shortcuts like his intentions were good, or he had moral clarity in his speeches, or it turned out well, so it's okay. But instead, think in these three dimensions and say that we can, as we make these judgments, do a better job than we've been doing so far. Why should we care? And that goes back to the title of the book, Do Morals Matter? We should care because morals do matter, and therefore we should be careful about how we make our moral judgments in foreign affairs. So let me end it there and throw it open for your questions and queries or rebuttals.
Great.
Thank you very much.